January 12, 1945. General Ernst Richter descended the concrete stairs into the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, carrying a leather folder that contained the end of the world. He was 60 years old. His uniform still fit perfectly after 35 years of service, though the face in the mirror that morning had looked like it belonged to someone older, someone who had seen too much. The folder held intelligence summaries from Army Group A: 2 million Soviet soldiers, 7,000 tanks, 41,000 artillery pieces massing along the Vistula River from the Baltic to the Carpathians. He had two photographs in his desk upstairs. Friedrich, 26, killed at Kursk in the summer of 1943, leading his company against Soviet positions that should never have been attacked. Thomas, 24, missing at Stalingrad in January of 1942. Though Richter knew what missing meant after Stalingrad, it meant his son's bones were mixed with the rubble of a city that no longer existed. Every casualty report that crossed his desk now carried their faces. Every division destroyed was someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's fathers. He had run out of his own to lose. That was the only reason he could still do this job. The conference room was already crowded when he arrived. Officers stood around the map table in the harsh light of overhead bulbs. Field Marshal Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, tall and ramrod straight, the perfect Prussian soldier who had stopped offering professional military advice years ago. General Jodl, Chief of Operations, competent and careful, a man who had learned to survive by saying nothing that might cause offense, a handful of adjutants and stenographers, and at the head of the table, studying maps with an intensity that suggested he could change reality by staring hard enough, the Supreme Commander himself. The Führer was 56 but looked 70. His left hand trembled constantly now. He hunched forward over the maps, his face pale in the electric light, his eyes moving across the colored pins and unit markers as if they represented actual divisions with actual soldiers instead of the hollow shells most of them had become. Richter opened the folder and placed the first intelligence summary on the table. The room went quiet. Even the stenographers stopped their constant scribbling. Main Führer, Army Group A reports significant Soviet force concentration along the entire Vistula front. Our reconnaissance estimates 2 million troops, 7,000 tanks, and over 40,000 artillery pieces. Multiple indicators suggest an offensive is imminent, possibly within 24 to 48 hours. The Führer's hand swept across the map, dismissing entire army groups with a gesture that might have been shooing away a fly. Exaggerated reports. This is Galen's doing. He meant his chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front, a man whose crime was accuracy. These inflated numbers, they're meant to make me nervous, to justify retreats that are not necessary. Richter had prepared for this response. He had 17 additional intelligence summaries in the folder, each one confirming the same basic facts through different sources. He began laying them out on the table one by one, speaking calmly, professionally, the way he had briefed operations for 3 decades. Mein Führer, we have confirmation from multiple sources: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, prisoner interrogations, civilian reports from across the front. The force concentration is real. The offensive is coming. The Führer barely glanced at the papers. Then they will be thrown back. Counterattacks will restore the line. The question came out of Richter's mouth before he could stop it. It was the question that would define everything that followed, the question that would be asked in various forms thousands of times over the coming months, the question that would never be adequately answered. With what forces? The room seemed to contract. The stenographers' pens froze above their notepads. Keitel's face went carefully blank. Jodl studied his boots. The Führer did not answer directly. Instead, he began talking about new weapons, jet aircraft that would sweep the skies clear of Soviet planes, the new type WWII U-boats that would cut Allied supply lines, divisions that existed only on organizational charts being moved on the map as if they contained actual soldiers with actual weapons. He talked for 20 minutes without addressing Richter's question at all. When the conference ended, Richter gathered his papers in silence. Keitel approached him as they climbed the stairs back to the upper levels of the Chancellery. Ernst, you must be more careful. These direct questions, this challenging tone, it serves no purpose. Richter stopped on the stairs and turned to face the field marshal. What purpose does silence serve? We are about to face the largest Soviet offensive of the war with forces that exist primarily on paper. Someone must tell him the truth. Keitel's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He does not want the truth. He wants confidence. He wants certainty. He wants to hear that we can still win. Can we? Keitel had no answer. He continued up the stairs without looking back. That evening, alone in his office, Richter wrote a letter to his wife Margaret at their home in Bavaria. He had been writing her almost every night for 3 years since their sons had died. The letters were the only place he could say what he actually thought. My dearest Margaret, tonight I told them the truth about what is coming. I do not think they wanted to hear it. Sometimes I wonder if Friedrich and Thomas were the fortunate ones. They died believing in something. The men who will die in the coming months will die for a lie that everyone can see, but no one will acknowledge. Every casualty report that crosses my desk now carries their faces. Every soldier in those reports is someone's son. I have none left to lose. Perhaps that is why I can still speak plainly. What can they take from me that has not already been taken? With all my love, Ernst. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the morning mail. Then he opened his desk drawer and looked at the photographs. Friedrich in his lieutenant's uniform, so proud, so young, weeks before Kursk. Thomas in winter gear, grinning at the camera, months before Stalingrad. Neither of them had reached 30. Neither of them had married or had children or done any of the things young men are supposed to do with their lives. He closed the drawer and returned to the casualty reports. 3 days later, January 15th, the Soviet offensive began exactly as the intelligence summaries had predicted. It started with an artillery barrage that could be heard 100 kilometers away, 40,000 guns firing in sequence, a rolling thunder that went on for 2 hours. When the barrage lifted, the tanks came forward in waves. The first reports reached the bunker by mid-morning. By afternoon, it was clear the front was collapsing. Army Group A defending Poland was disintegrating under the hammer blow. Entire divisions were simply ceasing to exist. The Soviets were advancing up to 40 kilometers per day in some sectors, a pace that suggested not breakthrough but total collapse. That evening's conference room was tense in a way Richter had rarely experienced. Even the stenographers seemed nervous, their pens scratching faster than usual across their notepads as if speed could somehow change what was being recorded. Richter laid out the updated situation maps. The red arrows showing Soviet advances covered the table like wounds bleeding across the paper. Mein Führer, the offensive has penetrated our forward positions along a front of nearly 200 kilometers. Army Group A has lost contact with several divisions. We estimate 40,000 casualties in the first 72 hours. The Soviets are advancing at a rate of 30 to 40 kilometers per day in multiple sectors. He paused, letting the numbers settle. 40,000 casualties. 40,000 men who would not be going home. 40,000 families who would receive telegrams or visits from somber officers, or, more likely as the war ground on, simply silence where letters used to come. The Führer studied the maps for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost contemplative. The Eastern Front has never been stable. It expands and contracts like a living thing. This is a contraction. We will stabilize it. Richter glanced at Jodl. The general's face was carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Everyone in the room understood the difference between a contraction and a collapse, between a planned withdrawal and a rout, between a tactical adjustment in the dissolution of entire armies. Everyone except, apparently, the man in command. But when the orders went out to the field armies that night, they bore no relationship to the reality Richter had just described. Army Group A was to hold its present positions. No retreat without explicit authorization from the Supreme Commander himself. Counterattacks were to be prepared and launched as soon as possible to restore the front line. Cities designated as fortified positions, as fortresses, were to be held to the last man. Richter read the orders in his office after midnight. He had drafted them himself at the Führer's direction, in the careful military language that made insanity sound reasonable. He thought about the soldiers who would receive these orders, the division commanders who would read them and know they were impossible, the company officers who would have to explain to their men why they were being asked to hold positions that could not be held, the individual soldiers who would follow orders because that was what soldiers did, even when the orders made no sense. He picked up his pen and began another letter to Margaret. They are sending boys to die for positions that cannot be held, with weapons and ammunition that do not exist, to satisfy military fantasies that bear no connection to what is actually happening. And I am the one writing the orders. What does that make me? He never finished the letter. There was a knock at his door. One of his aides entered, a young lieutenant named Werner, who reminded Richter painfully of Friedrich. General, there is a phone call for you. Secure line. Colonel Steiner from 12th Panzer Division. Richter felt something tighten in his chest. Wilhelm Steiner. He had known the man for 15 years, had watched him rise from captain to colonel, had personally recommended him for division command. Steiner was 42, professional, competent, the kind of officer the Army should have been built around. More than that, though, Steiner was something like a third son. After Friedrich and Thomas died, Richter had found himself paying attention to Wilhelm in a way that went beyond professional interest, making sure he got good assignments, offering advice that was more paternal than military, checking casualty lists with extra care whenever Steiner's division was in combat. He picked up the phone. Wilhelm. General. Steiner's voice was strained, exhausted. I wanted you to hear it from me before the official reports reach you. We took the full weight of the Soviet assault this morning. The 12th Panzer Division no longer exists as an effective fighting force. Richter closed his eyes. Casualties? 35% in the first 6 hours. Another 20% scattered or cut off. I have perhaps 3,000 men I can still account for out of the 15,000 we were supposed to have. A bitter laugh. Of course, we only actually had 4,000 to begin with, but the official strength was 15,000. So I suppose we've only lost what we never had. Where are you now? 30 kilometers west of our original positions. We are holding a village I cannot pronounce the name of, with men who have not slept in 3 days. I have 14 operational tanks. 14, General, against a Soviet force that appears to have more tanks than we have soldiers. Orders are being prepared, Richter said carefully. You will be instructed to counterattack, to restore the original front line. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Steiner spoke again, his voice had changed, had become softer, more personal. Ernst, I cannot do that. You know I cannot do that. If I follow those orders, everyone who survived today will die tomorrow for no purpose at all. Richter looked at the photographs on his desk, Friedrich and Thomas staring back at him from frames that he polished every morning. I know. Then what do I do? It was the same question Richter had asked in the conference room. With what forces? What do I do? Questions that had no good answers. Only the space where answers should have been. Do what you can, Wilhelm. Save as many as you can. I cannot give you official permission to ignore orders, but I can tell you that I understand the difference between what the orders say and what is actually possible. Use your judgment. Keep your men alive. For me, not for the others. Another long silence. Then quietly, I always have, General. For you. The line went dead. Richter sat in the darkness of his office, the only light coming from the desk lamp illuminating the photographs. Somewhere in Poland, Wilhelm Steiner was reading orders that Richter himself had written, orders that demanded the impossible, and Steiner would have to decide, as hundreds of officers across the front were deciding, how to obey orders that were fundamentally impossible to obey. How to attack without forces, how to hold without ammunition, how to win without any chance of victory. The orders arrived at Steiner's command post the next morning, January 16th. They were precise, detailed, and completely disconnected from any military reality Steiner recognized. The 12th Panzer Division, along with the remnants of 3 infantry divisions that existed mostly as names on organizational charts, was to execute a counterattack beginning at dawn on the 17th. Objective: restore the front line to its position as of January 14th. Time frame: 48 hours. Support: unspecified. Logistics: to be arranged. Consequences of failure: court-martial. Steiner gathered his remaining officers in the cellar of a farmhouse that served as their headquarters. They were a grim collection, these survivors. Men with hollow eyes and faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. Several of them he had known for years. Others were replacements who had arrived days before the offensive, young lieutenants who had aged a decade in 72 hours of combat. He spread the orders on a table made from ammunition crates and let them read in silence. Finally, his executive officer, Major Hans Wolf, looked up. Wolf was 40, a career soldier, competent and careful. He had a wife and 2 children in Hamburg. Steiner had attended their 7th birthday party the previous summer, back when there were still birthday parties in summers, and a world that made sense. "This is not possible," Wolf said quietly. "No," Steiner agreed, "it is not." "Then what do we do?" Steiner looked at the map spread across another makeshift table. The Soviet positions were marked in red, a solid wall of force that had barely paused after smashing through the German lines. His own division was a scattered collection of blue pins that bore no resemblance to the organized formation they were supposed to represent. "We attack," he said. 2 kilometers, a limited assault against the weakest point we can identify. We commit enough force to make it look real, to generate a report that says we executed the counterattack as ordered. Then we consolidate our positions and wait for the next set of impossible orders." One of the younger officers, a lieutenant named Friedrich, who could not possibly be older than 22, spoke up. "Sir, that is not following orders." Steiner looked at him. The boy had the same name as Richter's dead son. Steiner wondered if Richter knew that, if it made the boy's presence in the division more painful or more bearable. "No," Steiner said. "It is not following orders. It is keeping you alive. Those are not the same thing anymore." The attack went forward at dawn on the 17th. Steiner committed 1,200 men, 6 of his remaining tanks, and every artillery piece that still had ammunition. They advanced 2 kilometers against light Soviet resistance, occupied a small village that had been abandoned during the initial retreat, and then stopped. The after-action report that Steiner sent to headquarters described the attack as successful, the objective achieved, and the division now consolidating positions in preparation for further operations. Every word of it was a live omission. The objective had not been achieved because the actual objective, restoring the front line, was impossible. The attack had been successful only in the sense that it had not resulted in total annihilation. The division was consolidating positions because it had no capability to do anything else. But the report said what the report was supposed to say, and that was what mattered now. Not truth, but the appearance of obedience. Not reality, but the fiction that reality could be ignored if you simply refused to acknowledge it. Richter received the report in his office that evening. He read it twice, understanding immediately what Steiner had actually done. The younger man had executed the letter of the orders while completely ignoring their spirit, had created a tactical success out of strategic impossibility. It was exactly what Richter would have done in his position. It was exactly what any competent officer who wanted to keep his men alive would do. He filed the report without comment and moved on to the next crisis. By January 20th, the Soviet offensive had torn a hole nearly 300 kilometers wide in the German front. Army Group A was in full retreat, though the official report still spoke of flexible defense and tactical withdrawals. The Soviets were within 200 kilometers of Berlin. At this rate, they would reach the capital before the end of February. That evening's conference was the most tense Richter could remember. The Führer stood hunched over the map table, his trembling hand resting on the edge as if to steady himself. The colored pins representing German divisions were scattered across Poland like debris from a shipwreck. Richter had spent the afternoon preparing what he knew would be a controversial proposal. He laid out his recommendation calmly, professionally, trying to strip all emotion from his voice. "Mein Führer, I propose we evacuate Army Group North from the Courland pocket. 26 divisions are currently isolated on the Baltic coast, serving no strategic purpose. They are tying down our own forces that are desperately needed on the main front. If we evacuate them by sea, we can redeploy them to defend Berlin and the approaches to the Reich." It was sound military logic. Army Group North had been cut off for months, supplied only by sea, fighting a battle that no longer mattered while the main front collapsed. Every general staff officer in the room knew it made sense. Several of them had made similar proposals in the past. All had been rejected. The Führer's response was immediate and sharp. "Army Group North stays where it is. They tie down Russian forces. That is their purpose. Richter felt something snap inside him. It was not dramatic, not a sudden break, but more like a cable that had been under tension for too long, finally giving way. He heard himself speaking before he could stop, his voice rising, the professional calm evaporating. They tie down our forces. 26 divisions that could be defending the Reich are trapped in Courland, serving no purpose except to satisfy a strategic concept that no longer has any meaning. We are losing this war because we refuse to acknowledge military reality. The room went absolutely silent. The stenographers stopped writing. Keitel went pale. Jodl stared at the floor. No one spoke to the Führer this way. Ever. The Führer's face reddened. His voice, when it came, was cold and precise. I will decide what serves a purpose. I will decide strategy. You will execute orders. Someone must tell you the truth, Richter said. He was aware he had crossed a line, that there would be consequences, but after 3 years of watching men die for orders that made no sense, after losing both his sons to battles that should never have been fought, after lying awake night after night writing letters to his wife about casualty reports that read like murder, he no longer cared about consequences. The Eastern Front is not contracting, it is collapsing. We are losing this war. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Keitel stepped between them, his voice carefully diplomatic. Gentlemen, please. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. The conference ended shortly after. Richter gathered his papers and left the bunker, certain he would be arrested before morning. Instead, something worse happened. He was simply excluded. The next day's conference proceeded without him. He received a memo informing him that certain strategic discussions would be handled by a smaller planning group going forward. He was still chief of the general staff, still technically in charge of operations, but the actual decisions would be made without him. Keitel found him in his office that evening. Ernst, you must understand, after your outburst yesterday, the Führer cannot trust that you will support his decisions. His decisions are killing soldiers for no purpose. That is not for you to determine. Then whose determination should it be? The man who believes Army Group North is tying down Russian forces when it is clearly only tying down our own? Keitel's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Be careful. You have sons. Think of your family. My sons are dead, Richter said flatly. Both of them. Killed following orders that made no more sense than the orders we are issuing now. I have nothing left to lose except my conscience, and I will not lose that by remaining silent while more sons die for lies. Keitel left without another word. That night, Richter wrote another letter to Margaret. I spoke truth to power today, and power was not interested. I may have 3 months left in this position, if I am fortunate. They cannot arrest me without making it obvious that they are punishing honesty, but they can exclude me, and they will. I have become inconvenient. In this regime, that is the worst thing one can be. I miss our boys so much tonight. Every officer I see who is younger than 30 carries Friedrich's face or Thomas's smile. I am surrounded by ghosts of what we lost. Your loving husband, Ernst. The exclusion from conferences continued through the end of January. Richter still received reports, still issued orders based on the Führer's decisions, but he was no longer in the room where those decisions were made. He had been made irrelevant while remaining nominally in charge, a peculiar form of punishment that allowed the regime to maintain the fiction of his authority while stripping away any actual power. On February 5th, news reached Berlin that General Horst Mann, commanding 4th Army in East Prussia, had been relieved of command. The official reason was health concerns. The actual reason became clear when Richter read the classified reports. Mann had been ordered to hold his positions despite being in danger of total encirclement. The Soviets were driving toward the Baltic coast, attempting to cut off 4th Army from any line of retreat. Mann had requested permission to withdraw. Permission was denied, so Mann had withdrawn anyway, saving 60,000 men from certain capture or death. For this, he was immediately dismissed. Richter read the report 3 times, trying to find some other interpretation, some way to understand the decision that did not lead to the conclusion he was being forced to reach. There was none. Mann had been a true believer, a loyal officer who had never questioned orders until those orders became literally suicidal. He had saved an entire army. preserved 60,000 soldiers who could now fight another day, and for this act of professional competence, he had been fired. The message was unmistakable. Reality was less important than obedience. Results were less important than compliance. It did not matter if you saved 60,000 men if you did so by disobeying a direct order. Richter reached for his phone and called Wilhelm Steiner. The line was poor, full of static, but Steiner's voice came through clearly enough. "General Mann has been dismissed," Richter said without preamble. "I heard. For saving Fourth Army." "Yes." There was a long pause. Then Steiner said, "So we are not fighting the Soviets anymore. We are fighting reality, and reality is losing. Wilhelm, you must understand what this means. If you receive orders that are impossible to execute, you have two choices: obey them and die, or disobey them and be dismissed. There is no third option. There is no reward for competence or professional judgment. There is only obedience or consequences." "I understand," Steiner said quietly. "General, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Your sons, Friedrich and Thomas. If they were alive, if they were in my position, what would you want them to do?" Richter closed his eyes. It was the question he had been asking himself every night for 3 years. "I would want them to come home alive. Nothing else matters. Not orders, not duty, not loyalty to a regime that wastes their lives. Just come home alive. Then that is what I will try to do. For you, not for the others." The line went dead. Richter sat in the darkness of his office, thinking about Mann and his 60,000 survivors, about Wilhelm Steiner trying to keep his shattered division alive with no support and impossible orders, about all the officers across the front facing the same terrible choice between obedience and sense. The orders kept coming, each one more disconnected from reality than the last. On February 7th, Army Group Vistula was established as a new command to defend the approaches to Berlin. The appointment to command this critical formation was announced on February 10th, and when Richter heard the name, he felt what little remained of his professional faith collapse entirely. SS Commander Heinrich Weber was given command of Army Group Vistula. Weber had no military training. He had never commanded a combat unit. His entire career had been in the SS, in administration and politics, in ideological warfare rather than actual combat. His sole qualification for the position was absolute loyalty to the Führer. Richter learned of the appointment from a memo. He was not consulted. He was not asked for his opinion. He was simply informed that Weber would be taking command, that several divisions, including Steiner's 12th Panzer, would be transferred to Army Group Vistula, and that all operational questions should be directed to Weber's headquarters. He sat at his desk reading the memo again and again, trying to find some rational explanation for a decision that appeared to have no rational basis. There was none. This was not strategy. This was not even incompetence. This was something else entirely, something that went beyond military logic into a realm where loyalty mattered more than competence, where belief mattered more than reality. That evening, he made a phone call to Bavaria. Margaret answered after 2 rings. "Ernst, is everything all right?" "No," he said, "nothing is all right. They have appointed an SS commander with no military experience to defend Berlin. They have relieved competent generals for saving their armies. They have created a fantasy world where maps matter more than reality and obedience matters more than results. And I am powerless to stop any of it." "Then come home," Margaret said softly. "Ernst, you have done everything you can. You told them the truth. They did not want to hear it. Our sons are gone. We have each other. Come home before they take you too. I cannot leave while boys Friedrich's age are dying from orders I cannot stop. Someone must try to limit the damage. Someone must try to keep the lies from killing more than they already have. And if they dismiss you as they dismissed Mann, then at least I will have tried." He hung up the phone and sat in the darkness, thinking about Weber taking command, about Steiner receiving orders from a man who had never heard a shot fired in anger, about all the ways competence was being systematically replaced by loyalty and reality was being systematically replaced by fantasy. The letter he wrote to Margaret that night was the darkest he had ever composed. They have replaced competence with loyalty. An SS commander with no training will defend Berlin because he can be trusted to obey without question. The last honest men are being purged. Man is gone. I will be gone soon, and when all the truth-tellers have been removed, all that will remain is yes men and true believers, and the boys will die in numbers we cannot imagine for a cause that was lost months ago. I look at Friedrich's photograph, and I think how fortunate he was to die while there was still something to believe in. The men who will die in the coming months will die for a lie that everyone can see but no one will speak. God forgive us all. Your Ernst. He sealed the letter and set it aside. Then he opened his desk drawer and looked at the photographs one more time. Friedrich in his uniform, Thomas in his winter gear, both of them smiling, both of them gone. Every soldier who died in the coming months would be someone's Friedrich, someone's Thomas. Every casualty report would break someone's heart the way his heart had been broken, and he was powerless to stop it. The next morning, February 11th, Richter was in his office when the phone rang. It was Steiner. General, I have received notification. 12th Panzer Division is being transferred to Army Group Vistula under Commander Weber. We are to report to his headquarters for operational tasking. I know, Richter said. I received the orders yesterday. Ernst, may I speak frankly? Always. We are being commanded by a man who does not understand how armies work, who does not know how to read a map or assess a tactical situation or coordinate combined arms operations. Who was chosen because he will obey orders without question, even when those orders are militarily insane? Yes, Richter said simply. What do I do? It was the question again, the same question in different forms. With what forces? What do I do? How do I follow orders that cannot be followed? How do I keep men alive when obedience means death? You do what you have always done, Wilhelm. You interpret orders in the light of reality. You preserve your forces, you keep your men alive, and you trust that eventually reality will reassert itself, though I fear the cost will be terrible. And if I am relieved as man was relieved, then you will come home alive, which is all that matters. There was a long pause. Then Steiner said, General, when this is over, when the history is written, they will ask why we continued, why we followed orders we knew were wrong, why we sent men to die for objectives we knew were impossible. What will we say? I do not know, Richter admitted. I ask myself that question every night, and I have no answer except that we are soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, even when the orders make no sense, even when obedience and murder become indistinguishable. That is not an answer I can live with. Then find a better one, Wilhelm, and when you do, tell me what it is, because I cannot. The call ended. Richter sat alone in his office, surrounded by casualty reports and impossible orders and photographs of dead sons, and wondered how much longer he could continue to be part of a machine that turned young men into statistics and called it strategy. February 13th, 1945. Wilhelm Steiner stood in what remained of a schoolhouse on the outskirts of a village whose name he could not pronounce and stared at orders that demanded he do the impossible. Again. The building had taken a direct hit 3 days earlier. Half the roof was gone. Snow drifted through the gap and settled on the map spread across a table made from classroom desks pushed together. Outside, the temperature was 15 degrees below zero. Inside was not much warmer. The orders were typed on official Wehrmacht stationery, signed by SS Commander Heinrich Weber, countersigned by his chief of staff, stamped with all the proper seals that made insanity look official. The 12th Panzer Division, along with remnants of 3 infantry divisions that existed mostly as names on paper, was to execute an immediate attack against a Soviet bridgehead across the Oder River. Intelligence reported approximately 200 Soviet tanks in the bridgehead. Steiner had 9 operational tanks. The order specified that the attack would commence at dawn on February 14th and continue until the bridgehead was eliminated. Failure was unacceptable. Courts-martial would follow any lack of aggressive spirit. Major Hans Wolf stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. Wolf was 40 years old, had been with Steiner for 3 years, had survived Kursk and the retreat across Ukraine, and the horror of the January offensive. He had a wife named Anna and 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, who had just turned 8. Steiner had been to their 7th birthday party the previous summer, back when there were still birthday parties and summer leaves, and a world that occasionally made sense. He had watched the girls blow out their candles and thought about how Richter must feel, knowing his own sons would never have another birthday. 200 tanks, Wolf said quietly. We have 9. Yes, this is not an attack order. This is an execution order. Steiner looked at the map. The Soviet bridgehead was clearly marked, a bulge across the Oder that threatened the entire defensive line. In theory, it made sense to eliminate it. In theory, a concentrated attack by multiple divisions with air support and adequate artillery preparation could reduce the bridgehead and restore the front. In theory. In reality, they had 9 tanks, 4,000 exhausted men, no air support, and enough artillery ammunition for perhaps 4 hours of sustained fire. He thought about calling Richter, but Richter was no longer attending the planning conferences, had been excluded from strategic decisions, was being slowly erased from operational command while maintaining his nominal title. Calling him would only force the older man to acknowledge his own powerlessness. Better to make the decision alone. We attack, Steiner said finally. Limited assault, enough to generate a report that says we made the attempt. We commit sufficient force to make it look real, then we pull back and cite overwhelming enemy resistance. That is disobeying orders. No, it is interpreting orders in light of tactical reality. There is a difference, or there used to be. The attack was planned for dawn, but Steiner moved it to mid-morning, citing need for reconnaissance. That bought him 3 additional hours to prepare, to identify the weakest point in the Soviet perimeter, to position his meager forces for maximum impact with minimum exposure. He was not trying to eliminate the bridgehead. He was trying to survive contact with it while maintaining the fiction of obedience. At 7 in the morning on February 14, his artillery opened fire. 30 guns, carefully hoarded ammunition, a barrage that sounded impressive, but lasted only 20 minutes before falling silent. Then the tanks went forward, 9 Panzer IVs with infantry following in their wake. Steiner watched from a forward observation post, binoculars pressed to his eyes as his division executed an attack that had no chance of success, but had to look like it was trying. The German tanks reached the Soviet perimeter and immediately came under fire from positions that had not been visible on the reconnaissance photos. T-34s appeared from concealed positions, hull down behind earthworks, their 85mm guns firing at ranges where German armor had no advantage. The first Panzer IVs exploded before it had traveled 100 meters past the line of departure. The second threw a track and slewed sideways, blocking the advance. The third made it 200 meters before a direct hit turned it into a burning wreck. The infantry tried to advance through the gap between the surviving tanks. Soviet machine guns opened up from positions that should not have existed according to the intelligence summaries. Men fell in clusters, dark shapes against the snow. The attack lost momentum, stalled, and then began to flow backward as the survivors realized that forward meant death and backward meant maybe living another day. Steiner watched through his binoculars as the assault collapsed. He watched his tanks burning. He watched his infantry running. He watched the Soviet positions barely disturbed, the bridgehead untouched, the enemy barely inconvenienced by an attack that had cost him 1,200 men and 6 of his 9 remaining tanks. Wolf was directing the artillery to provide covering fire for the retreat. He was shouting into a radio handset, his voice tight with controlled panic. Steiner could hear pieces of the conversation. White sector, taking heavy casualties. Need smoke now. A pause. I don't care what headquarters wants. Fire the goddamn smoke, or there won't be anyone left to retreat. The smoke rounds began landing, white phosphorus blooming across the frozen ground, creating a curtain between the retreating Germans and the Soviet guns. Men stumbled through it, coughing, bleeding, dragging wounded comrades. Steiner counted them as they passed his observation post. 1,200 had gone forward. Perhaps 700 were coming back. Wolf appeared at his side, his face streaked with soot and sweat despite the freezing temperature. We need to pull the reserve back. The Soviets are preparing a counterattack. Do it. Get everyone behind the secondary defensive line. Prepare to hold there. And the report to headquarters? Steiner looked at the burning tanks, the bodies in the snow, the scattered remnants of an attack that had achieved nothing. Tell them we attacked as ordered. Heavy enemy resistance encountered. Bridgehead remains intact. Division requires 48 hours to reconstitute before further operations are possible. Wolf stared at him. They will order us to attack again tomorrow. I know. The report went to Weber's headquarters by radio that afternoon. The response came back within 2 hours. Insufficient effort. Lack of aggressive spirit evident. Attack to be renewed at dawn February 15th with all available forces. Failure will result in courts-martial of division command staff. Steiner read the message twice. Then he walked to the makeshift aid station that had been set up in the cellar of a nearby house. The wounded filled every available space, lying on the floor on blankets and coats, their blood seeping through improvised bandages. The division medical officer, an exhausted captain who looked like he had not slept in a week, was moving from man to man, making decisions about who might be saved and who was beyond help. How many? Steiner asked. 340 wounded. Another 280 dead that we've recovered so far. At least 100 more still out there in the snow. 700 casualties, almost 20% of his effective strength, lost in 3 hours for no gain whatsoever, and tomorrow they would be ordered to do it again. He returned to his command post and drafted a response to headquarters. Respectfully request postponement of attack to allow for casualty evacuation, ammunition resupply, and tactical assessment. Division combat effectiveness currently at 60%. Further immediate operations inadvisable. The response came back even faster than before. Request denied. Attack will proceed as scheduled. The Führer has ordered the elimination of this bridgehead. Orders will be executed. Steiner looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at Wolf. Tomorrow morning, we will conduct an artillery preparation at dawn. Maximum fire, all available guns. It will sound very impressive. After the barrage, we will send forward a reconnaissance force, perhaps 2 companies, to probe enemy defenses. They will encounter heavy resistance and withdraw. We will report that the attack was launched as ordered, but enemy strength prevented success. That is not what the orders say. No, but it is what will happen, because I will not send 1,200 more men to die tomorrow for the same nothing we achieved today. Wolf was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Colonel Mann was relieved for less than this. Colonel Mann saved 60,000 men. I am trying to save 4,000. If that costs me my command, so be it. But I will not murder my own soldiers to satisfy orders that make no military sense. The fake attack went forward as planned the next morning. Artillery barrage, reconnaissance in force, encounter with heavy resistance, tactical withdrawal. The after-action report was carefully worded to suggest maximum effort against impossible odds. It was a lie, and everyone knew it was a lie. But it was a lie that kept men alive. Weber's headquarters response was predictable. Insufficient effort, lack of aggressive spirit. Division commander to report personally to Army Group headquarters for consultation. Steiner made the trip on February 16th. Weber's headquarters was located in a commandeered manor house 30 kilometers behind the front lines. The building was warm, well lit, staffed by officers in clean uniforms who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Steiner arrived in a mud-spattered vehicle, his own uniform stiff with dried sweat and dirt, his face gaunt from exhaustion and too many nights without sleep. Weber received him in what had once been a library. The SS commander sat behind an ornate desk, maps spread before him, the very picture of a military professional except for the fact that he clearly had no idea what he was looking at. He was 50 years old, well-fed, his uniform perfectly pressed, his face showing none of the strain that marked every officer who actually commanded troops in combat. Colonel Steiner, your division's performance has been unsatisfactory. Steiner stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the trembling that came from too much adrenaline and too little sleep. Sir, with respect, my division has been in continuous combat since January 12th. We have sustained over 50% casualties. We are critically short of ammunition, fuel, and replacement personnel. We are being asked to execute operations that require force levels we no longer possess. Excuses. Weber's voice was flat. The Führer has ordered the elimination of that bridgehead. Orders will be executed. If you lack the will to carry out your duties, I will find someone who does not. Steiner felt something cold settle in his chest. This was how it would end. Not in combat, not fighting the Soviets, but here, in a warm library, being dismissed by a man who had never led soldiers into battle and had no concept of what was being asked. I have the will, Herr Gruppenführer. What I lack are the forces. The bridgehead contains approximately 200 enemy tanks and supporting infantry. I have 3 operational tanks remaining. I cannot defeat that force with aggressive spirit alone. Then you will use infantry assault tactics, massed assault, overwhelm them with numbers. I do not have numbers to mass. My division is at 40% strength. Then you will use what you have. Attack is scheduled for February 18th. You will execute it with maximum effort. No excuses. No request for postponement. If you fail, you will be relieved. Do I make myself clear? Perfectly clear, Herr Gruppenführer. Steiner was dismissed. He returned to his command post knowing that he had 2 choices. Execute the attack as ordered and watch what remained of his division destroyed for no purpose. Or refuse the order and be relieved, court-martialed, possibly shot. There was no third option. That evening he sat alone in the ruins of the schoolhouse and wrote a letter he knew he could never send. It was addressed to Anna Wolf, Hans's wife, though Hans was still alive, still serving as his executive officer. He wrote it anyway because he needed to say the words even if no one would ever read them. Dear Anna, if you are reading this, it means the war has taken a terrible turn, and I must speak truths I cannot speak while we fight. Your husband is a good man and a fine officer. We are being ordered to attack positions we cannot take with forces we do not have to satisfy the fantasies of men who have never seen combat. I want you to know that whatever happens to Hans, it will not be for nothing in the sense of sacrifice, but it will be for nothing in the sense of military purpose. We are trapped in a machine that turns men into corpses and calls it duty. Please tell Emma and Sophie that their father loved them. That is the only truth left. He never finished the letter. The door to his makeshift office opened, and Wolf himself entered, carrying a radio message. Sir, priority signal from General Richter. Steiner took the message. It was brief, written in the careful language of a man who knew his communications were monitored. Wilhelm, execute orders to best of your ability consistent with preservation of force. Primary mission is survival of your command. Acknowledge. Richter. Steiner read it 3 times, understanding what Richter was actually saying beneath the official language. Do what you must. Keep your men alive. I cannot give you official permission to disobey, but I am telling you that survival matters more than obedience. He looked at Wolf. How many men do we have fit for combat? Perhaps 2,500. Another 800 walking wounded who could fight if absolutely necessary. The attack on the 18th. We will make demonstrations, artillery fire, probing attacks, enough activity to generate radio traffic and observation reports. But we will not commit the main body. We will preserve the division. And when Weber relieves you, then you will take command and continue to keep these men alive. The 18th of February dawned cold and clear. At precisely 6 in the morning, Steiner's artillery opened fire on the Soviet bridgehead. It was not the sustained barrage Weber had ordered, but it was loud enough to be heard for kilometers. At 7, small groups of infantry moved forward in what looked like assault formation, but was actually reconnaissance elements with strict orders to withdraw at first serious contact. The radio reports flowing back to Weber's headquarters described heavy fighting, determined enemy resistance, German forces pressing forward against overwhelming odds. None of it was true. What actually happened was 300 men advancing carefully, making contact with Soviet outposts, exchanging fire for 30 minutes, and then pulling back to their starting positions. Total casualties, 18 men. The bridgehead, completely intact. But the after-action report read like an epic battle. Forces committed, division main body. Enemy encountered, heavy armor and infantry. Result, enemy positions tested. German forces repositioned for renewed assault. Casualties, moderate. Request resupply and replacement personnel before continuing operations. It was theater, all of it. An elaborate performance designed to maintain the fiction of obedience while preserving as many lives as possible. Steiner knew it could not last. Eventually, someone would realize that his casualty reports did not match the intensity of combat being described. Eventually, someone would visit the front and see that his division was not where it was supposed to be, doing what it was supposed to be doing. Eventually, reality would catch up with the lies. But not today. Today, 2,500 men were still alive who would have been dead if he had followed orders literally. 3 days later, February 21st, Steiner received a visitor. A staff officer from Army Group Headquarters arrived in a clean Mercedes, carrying orders for a personal inspection. Steiner met him at the command post, showed him maps, walked him through defensive positions, carefully selected to look active, while being far from the actual fighting. The staff officer was a captain, perhaps 30 years old, with the smooth face of someone who had spent the war in offices rather than trenches. He asked questions from a prepared checklist, noted Steiner's answers, and seemed satisfied with everything he was told. Just before leaving, he paused at the door. "Colonel Steiner, may I speak frankly?" "Of course." "We know what you are doing. The headquarters staff, we know. We read the reports and we look at the casualty figures and we understand that you are not executing attacks as ordered. You are conducting demonstrations and calling them assaults." Steiner felt his stomach tighten. This was it. The moment when the performance failed, when reality reasserted itself, when he would be relieved and possibly arrested. But the captain continued, his voice very quiet. "We also know that you are keeping your men alive, that your division still exists as a fighting force because you have refused to waste it on impossible objectives. Some of us at headquarters think this is the right approach. Some of us wish more commanders had your courage. And Weber? Gruppenführer Weber sees what he wants to see, which is reports of aggressive action and fighting spirit. As long as your reports say the right things, he will not look too closely at the details. Just keep doing what you are doing, Colonel. Keep your men alive. The war will be over soon, and Germany will need officers like you." The captain left. Steiner stood in the doorway of the ruined schoolhouse, watching the Mercedes drive away, and wondered how many other officers across the front were engaged in the same desperate theater, the same elaborate dance of obedience and survival. Through the final week of February, Steiner maintained his careful deception. His division fought where it had to, retreated when it could, and survived because he refused to waste lives on theatrics. The Soviets pressed forward on other sectors of the front, but Steiner's positions were secondary, unimportant enough that he could conduct his elaborate fiction without drawing too much attention. That night he received a radio call from Richter. The older man's voice was strained, exhausted. "Wilhelm, I wanted you to hear this from me directly. There is a city called Königsberg in East Prussia, garrisoned by 35,000 men under Colonel Dietrich. They have been under siege for 6 weeks. The Soviets offered surrender terms. Dietrich requested permission to negotiate. It was denied. Orders from Berlin, hold to the last man, no surrender, fight to the last bullet." Steiner waited, knowing there was more. The city fell yesterday. 35,000 casualties, almost total. The garrison fought until they had no ammunition left, then fought with knives and bare hands. For what? The city had no strategic value. Holding it changed nothing except that 35,000 men are dead who could have been saved. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand what happens when orders are followed literally. Because I need you to know that what you are doing, preserving your division, keeping your men alive even when it means disobeying orders, that is the only moral choice left. Dietrich followed his orders. His garrison is gone. Man disobeyed his orders. His army survived. You must be man, not Dietrich. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Good, because I will not be able to protect you much longer. They are moving me aside, Wilhelm, excluding me from decisions. Soon they will relieve me entirely, and when they do, you will have no one at headquarters who understands what you are trying to do." The call ended. Steiner sat alone in the darkness, thinking about Königsberg, about 35,000 men dead for nothing, about the choice between obedience and sense. The first days of March brought no respite. The Soviets were preparing their final offensive toward Berlin. Everyone knew it was coming. The only questions were when and where, and whether anything could stop it. Steiner's division, or what remained of it, held a section of front along the Oder River, waiting for the storm that would inevitably break over them. On March 1st, Richter called a conference in Berlin. It was the first time Steiner had been summoned to the capital since taking command. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, giving him time to drive the 150 kilometers from his positions to the Reich Chancellery. Berlin was a revelation. He had not been in the city for over a year, and the transformation was shocking. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble from Allied bombing. The streets were filled with refugees from the east, civilians fleeing the Soviet advance, pushing carts loaded with whatever possessions they had managed to save. The government buildings were still standing, still functioning, maintaining the fiction of normality while the world burned around them. The conference room in the Reich Chancellery bunker was the same one where the strategic situation meetings were held. Richter was there, looking 10 years older than when Steiner had last seen him. Several other general staff officers were present, and at the head of the table, studying maps with his characteristic intensity, was the Führer himself. Steiner had never been in the same room with the Supreme Commander before. The man was smaller than he had imagined, more hunched, more clearly exhausted. His left hand trembled constantly. His eyes, when they met Steiner's briefly, showed a disturbing disconnection from reality, as if he were looking through Steiner at something only he could see. Richter stood and approached the map table. He was carrying a folder. When he opened it and began laying out documents, Steiner recognized the format: equipment status reports, force strength summaries, the kind of bureaucratic paperwork that formed the skeleton of military operations. Mein Führer, I have prepared a comprehensive assessment of our armored strength on the Eastern Front. Richter's voice was calm, professional, the tone of a man presenting facts that could not be argued with. As of today, March 1st, we have 1,034 operational tanks deployed along the entire front from the Baltic to the Carpathians. This includes all types: Panzer Vs, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns. 1,034. He paused, letting the number settle. Then he laid out another document. Soviet armored strength, based on confirmed intelligence from multiple sources, exceeds 8,200 operational tanks. The force ratio is approximately 8-to-1 in their favor. The room was absolutely silent. Even the stenographers had stopped writing. I am recommending immediate concentration of all available armor at Seelow Heights, east of Berlin. This represents our best defensive terrain. We create a mobile reserve. We use the high ground to our advantage. We fight a defensive battle where terrain partially offsets numerical inferiority. This is our best chance to delay the Soviet offensive and buy time for evacuation of civilians and preparation of Berlin's defenses. It was sound military logic, textbook tactics. Exactly what any competent general staff would recommend when faced with overwhelming enemy superiority. Steiner watched the Führer's face, hoping to see some recognition that the proposal made sense. Instead, the Supreme Commander began talking, not responding to Richter's proposal, but talking past it, around it, as if the words existed in a separate reality that did not have to acknowledge the one Richter had just described. He spoke about the superiority of German equipment, about how one German tank was worth 5 Soviet tanks because of training and tactics and fighting spirit, about how the Tiger tank's 80mm gun could destroy T-34s at ranges where the Soviet guns could not reach, about how the Panther's armor was proof against most Soviet weapons, about morale and determination, and the fact that German soldiers knew they were fighting for their homeland while Soviet soldiers were invaders fighting far from home. He talked for 40 minutes. Richter stood silently, his face carefully neutral, while the Führer's monologue washed over the room. Steiner listened with growing horror, understanding that this was not a discussion, but a performance. That facts were being systematically replaced with fantasy, that every word being spoken was true in some abstract technical sense, while being completely divorced from operational reality. When the Führer finally stopped talking, he had not addressed Richter's proposal at all. Instead, he issued new orders. The available armor would be dispersed along the entire front in small groups, attached to infantry divisions for local support. There would be no concentration, no mobile reserve, no defensive battle at Seelow Heights. The tanks would be scattered, ensuring that the 8-to-1 numerical advantage would become an overwhelming local superiority at every point of contact. It was the worst possible tactical decision. It guaranteed that German armor would be defeated in detail, overwhelmed at each position before reinforcements could arrive, destroyed piecemeal instead of concentrated for maximum effect. Any junior officer at Staff College could have explained why this was wrong, but no one said anything. The orders were given. They would be followed. After the conference, Richter found Steiner in the hallway. The older man looked utterly defeated, his shoulders slumped, his face gray with exhaustion. "You heard?" "Yes, General." 8-1. I gave him the numbers. I showed him the reports. I proposed the only tactical solution that has any chance of success, and he ignored all of it to talk about equipment, superiority, and fighting spirit. "What do we do?" Richter looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "We are being led by a madman, Wilhelm. A man who has lost the ability to distinguish between what he wishes were true and what is actually true. And there is nothing we can do to change that." 2 weeks later, March 15th, orders came dispersing Steiner's remaining 3 tanks to different infantry divisions. The 12th Panzer Division would continue to exist on organizational charts, but it would have no tanks. It would be a Panzer Division in name only, a hollow designation that bore no relationship to reality. Steiner read the orders and understood what they meant. The German army was being systematically destroyed not by Soviet attacks, but by its own command decisions, by orders that made no military sense but could not be questioned, by a strategic vision that existed only in the map rooms of Berlin and had no connection to what was actually happening on the ground. On March 28th, Richter called him one final time. "Wilhelm, I have been relieved of my position. Official reason is health concerns. Actual reason is that I kept trying to tell them the truth, and they no longer want to hear it." Steiner felt something break inside him. Richter had been the last connection to sanity, the last senior officer who understood the difference between orders and reality. With him gone, there would be no one at headquarters who cared about keeping soldiers alive, no one who saw through the fantasies, no one who would protect junior officers who tried to preserve their commands instead of wasting them on impossible objectives. Who is replacing you? General Krebs, a competent staff officer, more importantly, a man who knows how to agree with whatever he is told. They are replacing truth-tellers with yes men, Wilhelm. They are systematically removing anyone who might question orders or present facts that contradict the official reality. What happens now? Now we wait for the final Soviet offensive. It is coming, probably mid-April. When it comes, it will be overwhelming. Berlin will fall. The war will end. The only question is how many men will die in the interim. And what should I do? There was a long silence. Then Richter said, "Save as many as you can. That is all we can do now. Save as many as you can and bring them home alive. The war is lost, Wilhelm. Everyone knows it except the man giving the orders. Your job is to survive long enough to tell the truth when this is finally over." "I will try. I know you will. You have been like a son to me these past years. When Friedrich and Thomas died, I had no one left. You gave me purpose, Wilhelm, someone to protect, someone to guide. I want you to understand that everything I have done, every order I questioned, every fight I picked with the Supreme Commander, all of it was trying to keep you and men like you alive. I failed. I could not stop the madness, but I tried." Steiner's voice was thick. "You saved more lives than you know, General. Every officer who saw you stand up and speak truth, every commander who understood that someone at headquarters still cared about reality, we all drew strength from that. You did not fail. You were the last honest man. That matters." Does it? I wonder. What good is honesty if it changes nothing? What good is truth if no one wants to hear it? It matters because we will remember. When this is over and they ask us why we continued, why we followed orders we knew were wrong, we can say that some of us tried to stop it, that not everyone was complicit, that there was at least one man who spoke truth even when it cost him everything. Richter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Wilhelm. That helps. Be safe. Come home alive. That is the only order that matters now." The call ended. Steiner sat alone in his command post, now relocated to a cellar in a town that had been shelled so heavily its name was no longer visible on any street signs. His division consisted of 1,800 men, no tanks, 3 working artillery pieces, and enough ammunition for perhaps one day of sustained combat. The Soviet offensive was coming, everyone knew it, and when it came, there would be no stopping it. He thought about Richter, dismissed for telling the truth, about Mann, relieved for saving his army, about Dietrich and his 35,000 dead in Königsberg, about all the officers trying to navigate the impossible space between obedience and sense, between following orders and keeping their men alive. On March 30th, the radio in Steiner's command post crackled to life with a special announcement. The Führer's voice, recorded earlier, broadcast to all units on the Eastern Front. A proclamation, a speech, a promise. Soldiers of the Eastern Front, the enemy is preparing their final assault. They believe they can destroy the Reich, but they do not know the strength of German resistance, the power of German weapons, the determination of German soldiers. Every position will be held. Every attack will be thrown back. Berlin will never fall. The transmission ended. Steiner's radio operator, a corporal who had been with the division since Poland, looked at him. "Sir, do you believe that? That Berlin will never fall?" Steiner thought about the 8,000 Soviet tanks, about the dispersion of German armor that guaranteed defeat, about Richter dismissed for presenting facts, about orders that existed in one reality while the war existed in another. "No, Corporal, I do not believe that. Berlin will fall, and when it does, 50,000 boys are going to die defending a lie." He walked outside into the cold March evening. Somewhere in Bavaria, Richter was sitting in his home with his wife, Margaret, probably looking at photographs of Friedrich and Thomas and wondering what it had all been for. Somewhere in Berlin, men who had replaced competence with loyalty were moving colored pins on maps and believing that the pins represented actual divisions, actual fighting power, actual hope. And here, in a ruined town whose name he did not know, Wilhelm Steiner stood with 1,800 survivors and waited for an offensive that would sweep them away like dust before a storm. His radio operator called from the doorway. "Sir, message from General Richter." Steiner returned to the cellar. The message was brief, transmitted on a frequency he knew was monitored, written in careful language that had to pass censors. But beneath the official words, he could read what Richter was actually saying. "Wilhelm, final offensive estimated mid-April. Your orders will be to hold assigned positions against all enemy attacks. Primary mission as always, survival of command, acknowledge, Richter." Steiner drafted his response with equal care. "General, understood. Will execute all orders consistent with preservation of force. Request your counsel on tactics for extended defensive operations." Steiner. It was a request that would never be answered. Richter was no longer in a position to offer counsel. He had been removed from the chain of command, excluded from operations, reduced to a pensioner with a general's rank, but no authority. The message was not really asking for advice. It was saying goodbye. That night, Steiner wrote a final letter to Ernst Richter. He knew he would never send it, but he needed to write it anyway, needed to say things that could not be said over monitored radio channels or in official reports. "General, when this is over and they ask us why we continued, I will tell them about you, about the man who tried to stop it, who spoke truth when everyone else remained silent, who cared more about soldiers' lives than his own career. You told me once that every soldier is someone's son. You lost your sons and spent the rest of the war trying to save everyone else's. I want you to know that you succeeded more than you failed. Every man I have kept alive these past months, I kept alive because you taught me that survival matters more than obedience. You were the last honest man in a regime built on lies. History will remember that. I will make certain of it. Your student, Wilhelm." He folded the letter and placed it in his uniform pocket, knowing it would probably be on his body if he was killed in the coming offensive, knowing that maybe, someday, someone would find it and deliver it, and Richter would understand that his fight had mattered. Outside, the night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before storms, before offensives, before the world ended. Steiner stood in the darkness and waited for dawn, knowing that when it came, it would bring orders that could not be followed, and choices that could not be avoided, and death that could not be prevented. The gap between what they said and what was real had grown so wide that the two realities no longer touched. In one world, Berlin would never fall, and German soldiers would throw back the enemy, and victory was still possible. In the other world, the war was already lost, and the only question was, how many more would die before everyone admitted it? Steiner lived in the second world, but he was commanded by men who inhabited the first, and there was no bridge between them anymore. Only the widening abyss, growing deeper with every passing day, measured in lives that could not be saved and truths that could not be spoken. April 16th, 1945. The Soviet final offensive began at 4 in the morning with an artillery barrage that turned the sky red. Wilhelm Steiner stood in the cellar that served as his command post and felt the building shake with each impact. Dust rained from the ceiling. The single electric bulb swayed on its wire, casting shadows that danced across the maps spread on a table made from ammunition crates. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 41,600 artillery pieces. The numbers had been in the intelligence summaries for weeks. Everyone reading them, everyone understanding what they meant. This was not an attack. This was an avalanche, a force of nature that could not be stopped, only survived if you were fortunate enough to be somewhere else when it hit. Steiner's command now consisted of 1,800 men spread across 12 kilometers of front that should have been held by a full division of 15,000. He had 3 working artillery pieces, no tanks, ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained combat, and orders that arrived by radio 30 minutes before the barrage began, orders that demanded he hold his assigned positions against all attacks, that withdrawal without explicit authorization would be considered desertion, that Berlin was counting on every soldier to do his duty. The radio operator, Corporal Fischer, looked up from his set. "Sir, Army Group is requesting situation reports from all units. Tell them we are under heavy artillery fire, casualties mounting. We'll report again when the situation clarifies." It was a lie. Casualties were actually minimal because Steiner had pulled his men back from the forward positions 2 days earlier, anticipating exactly this bombardment. The trenches being shelled were empty. The bunkers were abandoned. His actual defensive line was 3 kilometers behind the positions marked on the maps he had submitted to headquarters. It was one more fiction in a war that had become nothing but fictions, one more gap between what he reported and what was real. The barrage continued for 2 hours. When it finally lifted, the Soviet tanks came forward in waves. Steiner watched through binoculars from an observation post on a small rise, counting them as they emerged from the smoke and dust. 50 tanks in the first wave, another 70 in the second. More behind those, so many that he stopped counting. This was not a tactical assault. This was obliteration, the kind of force that did not take positions but simply erased them. His forward observers called in reports. The Soviets had discovered the forward trenches were empty. They were advancing rapidly, expecting to find the main defensive line. What they would find instead was nothing for 3 kilometers, and then a thin screen of German soldiers who had no chance of stopping them, but might, if fortune smiled, delay them long enough to retreat again. Major Wolf appeared at Steiner's side. Hans looked like he had aged 20 years in the past 2 months. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking slightly from too many days of adrenaline and not enough sleep. "Wilhelm, we cannot hold this. Even the fallback positions. We are spread too thin. The Soviets will be through us in hours." "I know. Then what do we do?" Steiner looked at the map, at the blue pins representing his scattered companies, at the red arrows showing Soviet advance routes. There were no good options. Stay and be overrun. Retreat without authorization and face court-martial. Try to hold and watch his men die for positions that had no strategic value and could not be defended. We hold for 6 hours, long enough to generate reports of heavy fighting. Then we begin a fighting withdrawal, slowly with artillery support, making it look like we are being pushed back rather than choosing to retreat. We fall back to the Silo Heights. If we can reach the high ground, we might have a chance. And if headquarters orders us to return to our original positions, then we will be too heavily engaged to comply. Sometimes the best way to disobey orders is to be too busy following them. The fighting began in earnest around noon. Soviet infantry supported by tanks hit the German positions. Steiner had positioned his men carefully, using terrain and prepared defenses to maximize the impact of their limited firepower. His 3 artillery pieces fired until their barrels glowed red, then fell silent as ammunition ran out. His infantry fought with rifles and Panzerfausts, the handheld anti-tank weapons that were useless beyond 100 meters, but deadly at close range. They held for 3 hours, then 4, then 5. Men died in 1s and 2s, machine gun nests overrun, foxholes buried by tank tracks. The Soviets kept coming, wave after wave, and the German line bent and stretched and finally began to break, not from failure of courage, but from simple mathematics. 1,800 men could not hold 12 kilometers against tens of thousands. At hour 6, Steiner gave the order to withdraw. Company by company, his men pulled back, covered by the few remaining heavy weapons. It was not a rout. It was a deliberate fighting retreat, exactly the kind of tactical movement that professional soldiers executed when holding was impossible. But collapse was unacceptable. They left their dead behind. They carried their wounded. They destroyed equipment that could not be moved. And they fell back toward the Silo Heights, toward high ground that might give them a chance to survive another day. The radio in Steiner's command post crackled constantly with reports from other units. The entire front was collapsing. Divisions were reporting breakthroughs, encirclements, loss of contact. The Soviet offensive was succeeding beyond anyone's worst fears. In some sectors, they were advancing 40 kilometers in a single day. That evening, in a new command post established in the cellar of a farmhouse on the slopes of the Silo Heights, Steiner received a radio call from Berlin. Not from Weber's headquarters, from the bunker itself. General Krebs, who had replaced Richter as chief of the general staff, was on the line. His voice was calm, almost eerily so. "Colonel Steiner, situation report. Heavy Soviet attacks all day. My division has withdrawn to secondary positions at Silo Heights. Casualties approximately 30%. Ammunition critically low. Request resupply and reinforcement. Your withdrawal was not authorized. Sir, the positions were being overrun. I executed a tactical withdrawal to preserve the division's combat capability." There was a pause. Then Krebs said something that made Steiner understand just how disconnected Berlin had become from reality. "The Führer has assessed the situation. This is the enemy's last gasp. They are throwing everything into this offensive. When it fails, they will have nothing left. Then we counterattack." Steiner stared at the radio handset. He had just watched the largest military offensive in history sweep across his front. He had counted hundreds of tanks, thousands of infantry, artillery concentrations that defied description. And Berlin's assessment was that this was the enemy's last gasp. "Sir, with respect, the Soviet offensive shows no signs of culminating. They have overwhelming force and are advancing on all sectors. Our defensive positions are being systematically destroyed. Your report is noted. However, the strategic assessment stands. Reinforcements are being prepared. General Weber's army will attack from the north. General Wang's 12th Army will attack from the southwest. They will cut off the Russian spearheads and restore the front. You are to hold your current positions and prepare to support the counteroffensive." Steiner looked at Wolf, who was listening on a second handset. The major's face was blank with shock. "Sir, when will these reinforcements arrive?" "Weber will attack within 72 hours. Wenck is being redeployed now. You must hold until they arrive. Berlin is counting on every soldier to do his duty." The transmission ended. Steiner carefully replaced the handset in its cradle. Then he sat down on an ammunition box and put his head in his hands. Wolf spoke quietly. "Wilhelm, Weber has no army. He has scratch units, Luftwaffe ground crew, old men and boys. Maybe 15,000 effectives total. And Wenck's 12th Army is engaged against the Americans 200 kilometers west. Even if they could disengage, they have no fuel to move. Those reinforcements do not exist." "I know. Then they are ordering us to die for nothing. Again." "Yes." Steiner thought about calling Richter, but Richter was gone. dismissed, no longer part of the command structure. He was alone now. Every officer on the front was alone, receiving orders from men who lived in a fantasy world where armies existed on maps but not in reality, where counteroffensives could be launched by forces that did not exist, where belief could somehow overcome the absence of ammunition and fuel and actual soldiers. Over the next 4 days, the Soviets pressed their attack relentlessly. Steiner's division, or what remained of it, fought a desperate delaying action on the Silo Heights. They used every advantage the terrain offered. They fought from prepared positions. They made the Soviets pay for every meter of ground. But there was never any doubt about the outcome. The Soviet force was simply too large, too well supplied, too overwhelming. By April 21st, Steiner had 700 men left, 700 out of the 1,800 who had started the battle. No artillery, no anti-tank weapons except for a handful of Panzerfausts. The Soviets were pushing past them on both flanks, ignoring the heights to drive directly toward Berlin. His position no longer mattered tactically. They were a speed bump, an irrelevance, forgotten by both sides in the race for the capital. That evening, he gathered his remaining officers. There were 5 of them, Wolf and 4 company commanders, all of them exhausted, all of them understanding that they were living on borrowed time. Gentlemen, we have 2 options. Stay here and die when the Soviets decide to finish us, or withdraw westward and try to reach American lines. One of the company commanders, a lieutenant named Graf, who had joined the division only 3 weeks earlier, spoke up. "Sir, withdrawal without orders is desertion." "Yes, it is. And I will take full responsibility. Any officer or man who wishes to remain and follow standing orders is free to do so. I will give you written authorization to assume command. But I am taking my men west. We are going to survive this war." The 5 officers looked at each other. Then Wolf said, "We stay together, all of us. If it is desertion, then we are all deserters." Steiner felt something break loose in his chest, a knot of tension he had been carrying for months. "Then we move tonight. Light order, no vehicles, move on foot through the forests, avoid Soviet units, avoid German military police, head west until we reach American lines or die trying." They moved out at midnight on April 22nd. 700 men filtering through the darkness, leaving behind their positions, their equipment, everything that could not be carried. It was desertion. It was abandonment of duty. It was also the only way any of them would see another sunrise. Steiner walked with them through the night, moving through forests and across fields, navigating by compass and stars. They encountered Soviet patrols twice and hid until they passed. They found German positions once and bypassed them, not wanting to explain why a full battalion was moving west when orders said hold and die. In Berlin, far behind them, orders were still being issued. The situation in the bunker on April 22nd was surreal, even by the standards of the past months. General Krebs stood before maps that no longer bore any relationship to reality, moving colored pins that represented armies which had ceased to exist. The Soviets were within the city limits. Street fighting had begun in the suburbs. The thunder of artillery was constant, close enough that dust fell from the ceiling with each impact. The Führer sat in a chair, his hands trembling, his face gray. He had been waiting for reports of Weber's attack from the north. None had come. He had been expecting news of Wenck's relief column from the west. There was only silence. Finally, he asked the question that everyone had been dreading. Why has Weber not attacked? Krebs, who had spent the past 3 days trying to find diplomatic ways to present catastrophic news, had no diplomatic answer left. Mein Führer, Weber's force was unable to assemble sufficient strength for an attack. The units designated for the offensive were not available as anticipated. Not available? The Führer's voice rose. I gave explicit orders. Weber was to attack with all available forces. Why has this not happened? Mein Führer, the forces did not exist. Weber had perhaps 12,000 men, mostly untrained, poorly equipped. An offensive was not possible. What happened next would be described by every witness as the moment when the last connection to reality finally severed. The Führer began shouting, his voice rising to a scream, accusing everyone in the room of betrayal, of cowardice, of sabotage. The generals had failed him. The people had failed him. The entire German nation had failed him. They were all traitors, all cowards, all unworthy of the greatness he had tried to give them. The outburst lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Officers stood frozen, no one daring to speak or move. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the rage ended. The Führer became calm, his voice dropping to normal conversational tones. "I will stay in Berlin. I will direct the defense personally. Weber will attack. Wenck will arrive. The situation will be restored." Krebs tried one more time. "Mein Führer, Weber cannot attack. Wenck cannot arrive. We must consider evacuating the government, preserving the command structure." The response was delivered in a flat, emotionless voice. "I am staying in Berlin. Anyone who wishes to leave may do so. I will remain and direct the final victory." There would be no final victory. Everyone in the room knew it, but the orders continued to flow outward from the bunker. Weber was to attack immediately. Wenck was to force march his army to Berlin. General Buss's Ninth Army, already encircled southeast of the city, was to break out and link up with Wenck. Together, they would relieve Berlin. On the maps in the bunker, it all made perfect sense. Arrows converged on Berlin from multiple directions. Relief columns drove toward the capital. The encirclement was broken. Victory was achieved. In reality, Weber's scratch force was being overrun by Soviet blocking units. Wenck's army was disintegrating as soldiers deserted or surrendered. Buss's Ninth Army existed only as scattered groups of survivors trying to escape westward. The arrows on the map bore no relationship to what was actually happening on the ground. By April 25th, Berlin was completely surrounded. Inside the pocket, perhaps 300,000 German soldiers in Volkssturm militia faced over 2 million Soviet troops. The battle had already been decided. All that remained was the killing. The orders from the bunker took on a hallucinatory quality. They spoke of counteroffensives and relief columns and final victory. They demanded that every building be defended, every street contested, every position held to the last man. They existed in a world where will and determination could overcome the absence of ammunition, where orders could conjure armies from nothing, where reality could be changed by refusing to acknowledge it. On April 26th, Krebs briefed the Führer on the actual situation. Soviet forces were fighting in the suburbs. The defenders were running out of ammunition. Many units had been reduced to small groups fighting from cellars and ruins. The end was perhaps 48 hours away, maybe less. The Führer studied the maps in silence. Then he asked, "When will Wenck arrive?" "Mein Führer," Krebs said very carefully, "Wenck is not coming. His army is being destroyed. He cannot reach Berlin." The silence stretched for almost a minute. Then the Führer said, "Then we will hold with the forces we have. Every building will be a fortress. Berlin will be defended to the last man." On April 30th, Soviet forces were within blocks of the Reich Chancellery. The bunker shook constantly from nearby explosions. The staff had been reduced to a handful of officers and aides. The maps on the table still showed phantom divisions, but no one was moving the colored pins anymore. There was no point. That afternoon, the Führer dictated his final political testament. An aide read it back to him, and several officers who were present would later describe the scene. The document blamed everyone for Germany's defeat, the generals who had betrayed him, the people who had not been strong enough, international Jewry that had poisoned the world. He took no responsibility, admitted no errors, learned nothing. His final military order was issued that same afternoon. The defense of Berlin was to continue. Every position was to be held. No surrender, no retreat. Fight to the last bullet. Hours later, he committed suicide. But the orders kept coming. Admiral Dönitz, named as successor, issued a statement to the armed forces on May 1st. "The Führer has fallen, fighting to his last breath against Bolshevism. His struggle continues. We will fight on." In the bunker, the remaining staff continued their conferences, continued moving phantom armies on maps, continued issuing orders to forces that no longer existed. The momentum of obedience had become stronger than reality. They could not stop giving orders even when there was no one left to receive them. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of Berlin's garrison, made a decision that had been forbidden by every order issued in the past 6 months. He surrendered the city, not because he was a coward, not because he lacked fighting spirit, but because continuing to fight served no purpose except to kill more soldiers and more civilians trapped in the ruins. The official Wehrmacht communique that day spoke of the heroic defense of the Reich capital and inflicting severe losses on the enemy. It did not mention the surrender. It did not mention that the war was over. It simply stopped mid-sentence, as if reality had finally broken through the wall of words and silenced them. On May 7, General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Eisenhower's headquarters. The next day, Field Marshal Keitel signed a second surrender document in Berlin for the Soviets. The war was over. Steiner and his 340 survivors reached American lines on May 5th, 3 days before the final surrender. They had walked nearly 200 kilometers, avoiding Soviet units, bypassing German military police who would have arrested them for desertion. They emerged from a forest in Bavaria to find American tanks and soldiers who looked at them with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. An American intelligence officer interviewed Steiner that evening. The man was a captain, perhaps 35, with the casual confidence of someone whose army had won. "Colonel, can you tell me why your unit was moving west instead of defending Berlin?" Steiner thought about the question for a long time. Then he said, "Because I wanted my men to live. Because orders had become disconnected from any achievable objective. Because obedience and suicide had become the same thing." "But you were soldiers. You took an oath." "Yes, an oath to defend Germany. Not an oath to die for nothing. There is a difference, though I am not sure anyone in Berlin understood that anymore." The American made notes. Then he asked, "Why did you keep fighting when you knew the war was lost?" Steiner had no answer. Or rather, he had no answer that made sense to someone who had not lived through the past 6 months, who had not watched the gap between words and reality grow until they existed in separate universes. "I do not know," he said finally. "Orders, I suppose, habit, fear, all of it. We followed orders because that is what we did. Even when the orders made no sense. Even when everyone knew the war was lost. We kept fighting because we were told to fight, and soldiers follow orders." The American looked at him for a moment. "That's not an answer, Colonel." "No," Steiner agreed. "It is not, but it is the only one I have." General Krebs was captured by Soviet forces on May 2nd during the fall of Berlin. His interrogation was recorded in Soviet files and preserved. The questions were predictable. Why had German high command continued fighting when defeat was obvious? Why had they issued impossible orders? Why had they sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives for objectives that could not be achieved? Krebs's answer was simple and terrible in its simplicity. "We were soldiers. We followed orders. The Führer ordered us to fight, so we fought." "But you knew it was hopeless?" "Yes." "Then why?" Krebs had no answer. Or perhaps his silence was the answer. They had followed orders because that is what soldiers did. They had spoken of victory because that is what was required. They had moved divisions on maps because the alternative was admitting that everything was lost. And when reality could finally not be denied any longer, when Soviet soldiers were in the bunker and Berlin was in ruins, they had simply stopped, like machines whose power had been cut. In Bavaria, Ernst Richter sat in his home and listened to the radio announcement of Germany's surrender. Margareta was beside him, her hand on his arm. The photographs of Friedrich and Thomas were on the table before them. "It is over," she said quietly. "Yes." "Did you do everything you could?" Richter thought about that question for a long time. He thought about the conferences where he had spoken truth and been ignored, about the officers he had tried to protect and mostly failed to save, about Wilhelm Steiner, who he hoped had survived but had no way of knowing, about all the soldiers who had died following orders that made no sense, orders that he had written himself at the direction of men who had lost touch with reality. "I tried," he said finally. "I tried to tell them the truth. I tried to save as many as I could. I failed more than I succeeded, but I tried." 2 days later, he received word that Steiner had reached American lines with 340 survivors. The news came through informal channels, officer to officer, the network of professional soldiers that transcended the chaos of defeat. Richter sat in his study and wept, the first time he had cried since his sons had died. Not from grief, but from relief that at least one of his boys had come home. In June of 1946, Richter was called to testify at Nuremberg. He took the stand and described the conferences in the bunker, the denial of reality, the impossible orders, the systematic replacement of competent officers with loyal ones. He spoke for 2 hours, his voice calm and professional, laying out the machinery of delusion that had ground up an army and called it strategy. The prosecutor asked him, "General Richter, could anyone have stopped this? Could anyone have prevented the catastrophe of those final months?" Richter considered the question carefully. "I tried. I was dismissed. General Mann tried to save his army by withdrawing. He was relieved. Colonel Dietrich in Königsberg followed his orders exactly, and 35,000 men died for nothing. Those who told the truth were removed. Those who remained either believed the fantasies or pretended to believe. By the end, I am not certain even they knew which. But surely someone could have refused orders. Someone could have said no. And then what? Be shot for treason? Be replaced by someone who would follow orders without question? The system was designed to eliminate dissent. By the time the final collapse came, there were no truth-tellers left. Only yes men and believers, and men who had convinced themselves that obedience was the same as duty." The prosecutor pressed, "General, you had sons who died in this war? Did their deaths mean anything?" Richter looked at the photographs he had brought with him, Friedrich and Thomas in their frames on the witness table. "My sons died believing they were fighting for something that mattered. The men who died in the final months died for orders that everyone knew were pointless. That is the difference. That is the tragedy. Not that we lost, but that we kept pretending we had not, kept giving orders to ghosts, kept describing victories that existed only in words." He paused, looking at the faces in the courtroom. "We said the Eastern Front would hold. We said victory was certain. We were wrong about everything, but we never stopped saying it." In 1947, Steiner published a memoir of his final months in command. The book was titled Orders and Reality, A Battalion Commander's War. It sold poorly. People did not want to read about the collapse. They wanted to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. But for those who did read it, the book offered something rare, an honest accounting of what happened when orders became disconnected from achievable objectives, when obedience became indistinguishable from murder, when the gap between words and reality grew so wide that truth itself seemed to die. The final chapter was titled The Question. In it, Steiner addressed the issue that would haunt every officer who survived those final months. People ask why we continued fighting when we knew the war was lost. I have thought about this question every day since the surrender. The honest answer is that I do not know. We followed orders because we were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders. We obeyed because the alternative was court-martial or execution. We kept fighting because stopping seemed impossible, because the momentum of obedience was stronger than reason. But those are explanations, not justifications. The truth is simpler and more terrible. We continued because we had lost the ability to imagine doing anything else, because the gap between what we were ordered to do and what we could actually accomplish had grown so large that we stopped questioning it. Because reality and orders existed in separate worlds, and we chose to live in the world of orders, even when the world of reality was crushing us. Every soldier who died in those final months was someone's son. I think of General Richter, who lost both his boys and spent the war trying to save everyone else's. I think of the men I could not protect, whose deaths served no purpose except to satisfy orders that made no military sense. I had no answer then. I have no better answer now. We continued because we could not imagine stopping, and that failure of imagination cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Ernst Richter died in 1952 at the age of 67. At his funeral, Wilhelm Steiner gave the eulogy. He spoke of a man who had tried to tell the truth in a regime built on lies, who had lost his sons and dedicated himself to saving other people's sons, who had been the last honest man in a command structure that had systematically eliminated honesty. General Richter taught me that every soldier is someone's son, Steiner said. He taught me that survival matters more than obedience when obedience has become indistinguishable from suicide. He taught me that speaking truth has value even when no one wants to hear it, even when it costs you everything. He was dismissed for these beliefs. But he was right, and those of us who survived owe our lives to the fact that at least one man at headquarters understood the difference between orders and murder. In the decades that followed, historians would debate what happened in those final months. They would analyze the decisions, study the orders, try to understand how a professional military command could become so disconnected from reality. The stenographic records were there, preserved, documenting every conference, every order, every denial of obvious facts. The casualty reports were there, hundreds of thousands of names, each one someone's Friedrich, someone's Thomas. The gap between what German high command said and what they knew had grown so wide that by the end, they inhabited two completely separate worlds. In one world, armies maneuvered and counterattacked and held firm. In the other world, those armies had ceased to exist. The soldiers were dead or captured or fleeing. The war was over. The tragedy was not that they lost. Every military loses eventually. The tragedy was that they kept pretending they had not. They kept giving orders to forces that no longer existed. They kept describing victories that existed only on paper. They kept demanding the impossible from men who had nothing left to give. They spoke of holding positions that had already fallen, of divisions that had already been destroyed, of counterattacks that would never come. And in the end, when the stenographers stopped recording and the radios went silent and the maps were rolled up, what remained was the gap between their words and reality. That gap was measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, in cities reduced to rubble, in a nation destroyed. Truth did not die in the bunker beneath Berlin. It died months earlier, in conference rooms where facts were dismissed and in orders that demanded the impossible. It died every time an honest officer was replaced with a loyal one. Every time a casualty report was filed and ignored. Every time someone spoke reality and was told they lacked fighting spirit. Truth died slowly, incrementally, murdered by 1,000 small denials until nothing remained except the gap between what was said and what was real. And into that gap fell the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, each one someone's son, each one dying for words that meant nothing, for orders that made no sense, for a victory that existed only in the imagination of men who had lost the ability to see what was actually in front of them. That was the final collapse, not of armies or nations, but of truth itself. And once truth died, all that remained was the falling.